Hi, Mum. Auntie I, Uncle Mike, lots of people. Nice to see you. So what's upmost on my mind? Well, I think we start the days here so often with this terrible count of 224 days since October the 7th and 132 hostages still held in Gaza, many of whom we hope are still alive, some of whom we know are still dead or are already dead, and in uppermost in my mind, it is one of my daughter's friends, good friends from school and from the youth movement, Naama Levy. You may know her name or know her face. Her story, Naama, is nearly 20. She'll be 20 next month. And on that morning, on Saturday, the 7th of October, she was actually, I think, at her first posting in her job there on Kibbutz Nahal Oz as an observer. And so she was one of the 5 young women soldiers who was captured and held hostage. So I guess that's what's upmost on my mind. That's how we start the day here on the news and the newspapers. Those numbers, the names and the faces are very much in our consciousness. That's what kind of frames really everything that's going on and has been going on here since the 7th of October. But it's been a particular week in Israel this week that started kind of really in that transition or in that run of days that start with Yom HaShoah, which was last Wednesday, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and then run through Yom HaZikaron, Remembrance Day, and Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day. Yeah, that's typically a week of introspection, but it's also one of national consensus. Those are 3 days where the agenda is clear. The agenda is set. It's something that happens every year, and there's a kind of a rhythm and there's a kind of a cadence to those days, which is kind of shared. They're often called the national days, and they bring people together across Israeli society, I think, to a large extent, focusing on those 3 issues or on those 3 kinds of thinking, of remembering. Yom Shoah and then Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut. But this year, like everything else, has been so different, so almost unrecognizable. So on Sunday night and Monday was Yom HaZikaron, and where sometimes that's a slightly abstract, distant act of remembrance or of connection, for far more people than usual. It's incredibly close and personal and direct, and needing no effort to remember. The big event on Erev Yom HaZikaron is a ceremony at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, and the main speech is given by the IDF Chief of Staff. So this year, as every other year, the Chief of Staff spoke, and this is Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, who has been was chief of staff on the 7th of October, before the 7th of October, and has been running the war effort since the 7th of October. And he spoke in a very personal way about his sense of responsibility, and that he is the commander who sent the men and women to fight, some of whom have not returned, some of whom have been killed. About 600 now soldiers were killed on the 7th and since the 7th of October. And that's a message that resonates very deeply, because here is somebody who is at the the head of the military, taking responsibility, taking personal responsibility. And that contrasts, and I'm sure you've heard this before, with a sense that our political leadership is not taking responsibility, not taking direct personal responsibility. Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff, has made it clear that he will leave, he will resign, and as have other heads of the security establishment. So that ceremony had a kind of a political element to it, but it also, in a way, was not as prominent, was not a kind of a focal point, like in Israel we talk about the campfire. Not everybody was around that particular campfire on Sunday night, and there were several alternative ceremonies dealing with remembrance, the largest of which was at the Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. It's the plaza in front of the Tel Aviv Art Museum, and it's opposite the main IDF base in Tel Aviv. And since the 7th of October has been the focal point of the protests and the rallies, the solidarity rallies of the families of the hostages. And there were 100,000 people in Kikar Chatufim, Hostage Square, on Sunday night. Massive protest, calling for the immediate return of the hostages, something that those families and people around them have been doing since the 7th of October. The lack of progress and the failure to bring the hostages back is a major feature of what's going on here. It's a deep trauma, it's a deep split in society, and it's becoming more and more evident that there are some people, many people, who are completely committed to bring the hostages back, and there are those who, for political reasons, I think, are less than committed. And so on Monday, when there were ceremonies at military cemeteries, there were 42 or 43 military cemeteries all across Israel. And the tradition is, or the normal state of affairs is that politicians and ministers are deployed, sent, allocated to go to each of those military cemeteries and to take part in the ceremonies. There's a siren on Yom HaZikaron at 11 a.m. and there's a ceremony at the cemeteries, and politicians speak. And this year there was great concern and disagreement about who should be sent whether politicians from right-wing or very right-wing parties would be welcome in places where the population is generally not centrist or left-leaning. And the national consensus, or the sense of national unity around this moment of remembrance, I think was really strained this year. There were incidents where politicians spoke, and there were demonstrations against them. There were bereaved families who refused to be in the cemetery when politicians came and spoke. And there were also protests in support of these politicians. And so at a time, at a moment of great sensitivity, politics and political disagreements are intruding even to these moments of what are normally moments of remembrance and consensus. And then we always have this very painful, I suppose, painful transition from Yom HaZikaron into Yom HaAtzmaut, where you move from grief and bereavement and remembrance into celebration. And it's always an odd event. This was on Monday night, Monday evening. It's always a slightly uncomfortable or challenging transition where at 8 o'clock Yom HaZikaron is over and Yom HaAtzmaut starts, and what normally happens is there are fireworks and songs and and this year that didn't happen. There was a ceremony. It's a ceremony where 12 people are invited and nominated to light torches representing various things that have happened over the year, or various issues that we want to note or celebrate. It's and this year that ceremony happened, but it happened with more than the usual number of torches. There were 18 for some reason. The ceremony was pre-recorded. It wasn't live. There was no audience, even though there was no security reason not, and the Prime Minister wasn't there. And the Prime Minister sent a pre-recorded message, which he'd done actually for Yom HaZikaron the day before. Nothing usual, nothing normal. The festivities, such as they were very muted, and everything really under the shadow of this ongoing war, this ongoing conflict, which shows no sign of end, where politics is becoming the dominant feature, the dominant motivator for what's happening here, and so it was an extremely odd and uncomfortable Yom HaAtzmaut. On Tuesday itself, the day itself, there are normally a couple of big events. There's the Israel Prize ceremony. The Israel Prize is the only kind of big national award, and again, hugely contentious this year. The education minister who's responsible for the Israel Prize, the whole Israel Prize thing, wants to cancel the prizes this year, kind of under the excuse that it was not the right year to be celebrating or acknowledging achievement and accomplishment. Although you might well argue that this is exactly the time when we want to remind ourselves of some of the accomplishments and achievements of the year, but really politically, why? Because one of the recipients was somebody from the left, a very strong proponent of democracy, supporter of democracy, a big opponent of the legal reforms that were attempted last year, which really amounted to an overthrow of the judicial system. And so again, the ceremony happened, but the Prime Minister wasn't there. He sent a pre-recorded speech. There were weird prizes awarded for national resilience and so on, very political. And it was held in Sderot, a town that you probably know of, just a few kilometers from the Gaza Strip. Has been under constant bombardment since the early 2000s. And the ceremony was held in Sderot as a kind of a sign of solidarity, but at the same time, a small group, maybe a couple of hundred of pro settlement right-wing activists marched or tried to march from Sderot towards Gaza, where they wanted to lay some kind of foundation stone for rebuilding the Jewish settlements that were uprooted or were removed from Gaza in 2005. And so again, normal but not normal, normal but and anything but normal. Wow, on Wednesday, the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant gave a press conference and made a speech where he's a Likudnik. He's in theory an ally of the Prime Minister, and gave a speech which was incredibly critical of the Prime Minister, saying that the Prime Minister has no day after strategy, which is true, by the way. It's clear after 7.5 months, Netanyahu doesn't have a day after strategy. But for Gallant, who's the defense minister, who's supposed to be responsible for our national defense strategy, to say this so publicly was surprising, and I'm not sure what it means for the political system at the moment, but it is another voice of growing opposition to Bibi. And it connects to another issue which is starting to bubble up, which is this question about recruitment and the draft, and whether the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, are exempt, will continue to have their exemptions, putting further political pressure on Netanyahu. And yesterday and today, the focus has also been on The Hague, where the International Court of Justice is hearing a case brought by South Africa and supported by Egypt and others, calling on the court to issue a ruling for Israel to halt the war, likely declaratory. The court doesn't have any powers of enforcement, but it would add further political pressure from other countries who are signatories to the statute of the ICJ, including the UK, and could put pressure on Israel with regards to arms supply and arms shipments and so on. So a week that was anything but normal, but perhaps reflective of our very, very abnormal normality at the moment. Just one point of, I don't know if it's optimism or something slightly positive. On Wednesday night, our youngest daughter, who's 13 and a half, in middle school, they did an all-night hackathon from 8 in the evening till 8 in the morning, where these 13, 14, 15-year-old kids were set the task of finding solutions or thinking about solutions to address some of Israel's big challenges ahead. What were they looking at? The housing crisis, the employment crisis, how to remember or commemorate the 7th of October and so on, 7 or 8 issues. And so there was something, I suppose, heartening that our kids, our young people, are being set those challenges, so that hopefully when we get out or start to move out of this situation, this terrible, awful moment in Israel's history, more than a moment perhaps, there are young people who have their eyes on a better future. I don't know if they came up with any ideas or anything interesting or useful, but I'm happy to think that they are putting their minds to that. And so it's Friday morning. I open the papers on Friday morning, as I always do, and I always go to a column written by a journalist in Haaretz called Yossi Werther. I think his column was also translated into English. Yossi Werter's first line this morning was, "This has been a week that all normal Israelis will certainly want to forget." And well, let me stop there and see what people want to talk about.
Gosh, okay. Thank you. It was really a week, and of course here we had similar discussions beforehand as to how to commemorate, how to celebrate, and we did celebrate at JW3 in a more muted way than we normally would, but it, as always, it's enjoined on us to keep the joy alive as well as the sorrow. But as you say, it's very hard, and some people just couldn't. People that would normally be upfront in these things are holding back and going, I'll do a little bit, but I can't do the full on. So one you may know, you may not, you mentioned Nama Levy at the beginning, and she's actually the new North London Synagogue's adopted hostage, and Jonathan Wittenberg is in regular contact with her mother Ayala. So just in case you didn't know, or for the audience that didn't know, so thank you, Sean, for doing that. So just as always, put your questions in the chat. We don't have very long, but please do. I think what I want to start with is optimism. You did try towards the end to be a little bit more optimistic, but the feeling at the moment, I think, is that we're entrenched. It's such a long time, and there's so little movement. We keep hearing snippets of there are peace talks going on, and there are something happening in Egypt and something happening in Qatar, but at the same time there's the bombs falling and amassing troops and worry. I think there's a constant worry, and I don't know how we deal with that and still stay optimistic, and I'm wondering whether you're able to stay optimistic. Are you?
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning, my day job is working for the leader of the Labour Party, who often says that optimism is a political choice, and so I think there is something of a choice about remaining optimistic, being pessimistic, or being is in a way is a kind of, it's a dead end if we allow ourselves to be only to be pessimistic about what there is and what we can see around us. It's kind of paralyzing, and so it's so important that we do keep looking at what can be done, what should be done. We keep articulating our vision of a different Israel, a better Israel, in the political sphere and in civil society. And it's worth noting, I think, the strength of civil society since the 7th of October. I mentioned that big demonstration in Hostage Square in Kikar Chatufim on Sunday night, and the protests that go on, and the sense of engagement. By the way, I think it's true on the across society, different parts of society. But that I think is something that is is a point of light in what is quite a gloomy scenario, I have to say.
Okay, so two very different questions coming in. We'll start with she's written Auntie I, so I will say Auntie I asks. Children and teenagers, it's so worrying for them, the trauma, and we've had a few trauma experts on, and it's always a little heartbreaking to hear them. But from your perspective, is there enough support in place for them? Is there any support in place for them? Or is it a matter of society working together?
Yeah, look, I'm not a trauma expert, although I am the parent of 3 young people. And my immediate thought is with Nomi, our 19-year-old soldier who has such a personal connection to this, and um, it is extremely, uh, closely connected to her group of friends, of whom Naama is one, and who spend most Friday afternoons with Ayelet, Naama's mum, and supporting each other. I don't know who gets more support from that, and I suppose that probably points to a wider feeling in the country, which is that so many people are affected by this. So many people have connections to this, not just to the hostages, but to the people who are fighting or have been fighting, or to nephews for several months. One of them has just been called back, and or to the people who have been displaced from the south and the north. And again, we have family connections with people, our family from the far north, from Kibbutz Matsuba. And so this is a trauma which is shared by so many schools, and schools here, I think, are very aware and very conscious of that. I hope that the kids and the young people, and that everybody's getting support. I know that the mental health system is under enormous stress, and is finding it hard to cope with the amount of trauma that there is. And I think that this is a long-term issue for us as well.
Oh, for sure, a long term. So the final question, you mentioned the North, and Kay asked whether you can comment on the situation in the North, and whether those displaced families, are so many of them, whether they will be able to return home at some point. I know you can't really answer that, but what's your take on it?
Well, yeah, I mean, so much of the focus, I think, is on the south, on Gaza, on what's happening around Gaza, and of course what's happening inside Gaza. And it's important to note, really important to note, that that both things are happening at the same time, and that complexity and that difficulty is really there and present for us. And so we're not necessarily focusing on the north as much, or I think that the reporting from Israel outside is far less focused on the north, and yet the north is really really on fire at the moment. It is, there are rockets all the time, dozens and maybe hundreds a day. I think 40 or so already this morning. And those people who are displaced, over 100,000 people displaced, there is no prospect of them going back at the moment. There was reports earlier in the week that the hotels who are housing some of those people have been put on notice that they may need to do so until the end of 2024. And that means that's a very important date, because it means that there is no expectation that by the 1st of September, people will be back home in the north. And the 1st of September is the opening of the school year. And so one wonders if kids have been moved from their schools for this school year, and there's no expectation that they go back for the beginning of the next school year. What happens to those towns? What happens to those communities? What happens to those societies when for 2 school years kids and their families are not there? And we haven't even started fighting in the north yet. We don't have a strategy for a military or a diplomatic response to what's happening in our relationship with Hezbollah on the Lebanese border, and what's happening in Syria, which is still in civil war. And so, yes, thank you. That is an important reminder that there is still so much that is not being addressed, and for which we, I think, don't necessarily have a plan.
Thank you so much. It's been an amazing half hour, and on an important week where we have these commemorations dates, anniversary dates. To hear
Thanks.
your point of view has just been another wake-up call of what it's like to be in Israel on a day-to-day basis, which we think we're thinking about, but when we hear these Friday mornings, we realize that we need the regular weekly reminder, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you for your incredible persistence and staying with it week after week. It's important. I know. I agree. It's important, but I want to thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Professor David Newman is now taking a weekly course on Zoom because he wasn't able to leave Israel due to being called for duty. But that's at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Please email me for details. There are various Israeli top people coming in the next few weeks. Those will be going up online very shortly. I will remind you of them, but do also contact me for more details. I wish you all a very safe Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom, and a good week. Jonathan, thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you in London too.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you to Helpons and Case for supporting all of us as well, and take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Shabbat Shalom. Toda raba. Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you.